you just claim that I got my morality from a religious tradition. Ask yourself, when you pick up the Bible or the Hebrew Bible or any holy book and find ethical wisdom in there, what is that process like? I mean, you pick up Leviticus or Deuteronomy, and you find that if a woman is not a virgin on her wedding night, you're supposed to stone her to death on her father's doorstep. Okay, presumably you choose to reject that pearl of ancient wisdom. And then you find another line, I think this is also in Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. Or the golden rule, as preached in the New Testament. And this resonates with you as a good operating premise to generate further moral intuitions. If nothing else, it's a good ideal to live toward. Now, that process, the guarantor of your morality in that case is not the book. It's in your brain. And this kind of truth testing is something that we bring to religion. Now, religion does a lot of work on people, and you can get good people to believe some very terrible things in the name of God, and this is what worries me about religion. And I think we waste time talking about Stalin and Hitler and Pol Pot, frankly, because these were political religions. These were dogmatisms through and through, and when anyone started to make too much sense in opposition to these dogmatisms, they were carted off for religious fanaticism.
I would say two things, and I suspect the second will be the basis of another conversation here. The first is that it is, let's say, I don't know that I like the word moderates, but it is healthy religion that provides the only hope for sick religion to be well. I don't think that there is any chance that the preaching of irreligion will in fact persuade those who are fanatic to change their ways, but I think those who know how to speak the same language have some chance of doing that. The second point that I would make is that when you talk about the needless suffering that religion has caused, I think that it's time maybe to address the historical record, because I think that religion's record is nothing less than exemplary compared to irreligion. And so I would say that if you're going to try in this world to make a decent world, that historically speaking, although I won't speak for the future, you're much better off training people.
I think the one thing to notice is that the dialogue between science and religion has gone this way. It has been one of relentless and one-directional erosion of religious authority. I would challenge anyone here to think of a question upon which we once had a scientific answer, however inadequate, but for which now the best answer is a religious one. Now you can think of an uncountable number of questions that run the other way, where we once had a religious answer, and now the authority of religion has been battered and nullified by science and by moral progress and secular progress generally. And I think that's not an accident. And the one area where religion still seems to hold its ground is now under assault by science, and it's very good that it is under assault by science. And this is the whole issue of morality and human happiness and what constitutes the good life. These are, and let me just tell you why I think this is a scientific question. Even the place of science is ultimately a scientific question. Because surely there are objective facts to be learned about the basis of human happiness. The moment you recognize that morality and spirituality and value is a matter of happiness and suffering, and that we're moving suffering in the direction of happiness, then you realize that if there are objective facts to know about human happiness, and surely there are facts about the way that genes and ideas and uses of attention and economic systems, social structures, all of these conspire to make us happy or miserable. And again, it's true that scientific discourse is just in the beginning of addressing these issues. But it's not too soon to say that love is better than hate in terms of ethics. And we are studying these things at the level of the brain. Eventually we will understand the brain basis of love and hate and the kinds of mechanisms, both cultural and personal, that ramify these states of mind. And there will be right and wrong answers. And we'll find, for instance, that honor killing is a bad strategy if you want to raise compassionate men. We know that already, but at some point we will know this biochemically.
What do you think of that?
Well, first of all, I can think of a couple of examples, although I don't think that that's crucial. But for example, Marxism, which was the scientific study of societies and was thought of as a science.
Nobody thinks that's science.
Nobody thinks it is now. You said an answer now that people once thought was scientific, but no longer do. That's a good example.
Oh, no, but
a religious answer.
Let me just clarify my question.
But a religious answer to life is much better now than this poor science that was Marxism, or for that matter, I would say, than the not very good science that was Freudianism. But go ahead.
Well, I agree on both counts. It's just that the point to make is that the antidote to bad science or failed science or scientific incompleteness is good science and more science. It's not religion.
By the way, I want to preempt that answer for religion. That's exactly the answer to bad religion or poor religion or failed religion is more religion, instead of saying that religion ought to be banished because, for example, people think mistakenly that good religion is flying planes into buildings. But I also think that the way that you set it up at the beginning is not the way that it used to be or that it has to be. That is, science and religion weren't classically in opposition, except in certain specific instances. And even those instances are much more complicated than we suspect. You know, Galileo and the Pope Urban, were friends. And there is a friendship issue as well as a lot of political issues that were involved in Galileo's eventual recantation. It wasn't just there was faith over here and there was Galileo over there, when in fact there were people in the church who agreed with Galileo. And Newton was a devout Christian, as you may know. And the relation between science and religion wasn't classically just oppositional. It was sometimes oppositional, but more often synergistic. And people believed that they coexisted as they should. But you can't answer the question of what's a good life scientifically. You can't.
Why not?
I can say what will make you feel a certain way. But whether that's good, let me give you an example. You talked about happiness. There are some people who've lived very unhappy lives that religiously you would evaluate as very good lives. I mean, Rabbi Akiva at the end of his life was not happy. Right? I mean, he was martyred. But if you were to bring Rabbi Akiva back to life and say, would you say that the end of your life was good or bad? He would say, I have no doubt, painful but good. And if you said to him, but what about scientifically? He would say, well, scientifically I was being burned alive. But you can't evaluate my life scientifically. And in fact, I just want to give one little sermonic coda here. Anybody, just one. Yeah. Just one for the moment. Okay. How could you know me so quickly? Anybody who has children or who believes that they're doing something important in this world, or who works in difficult circumstances to bring water to villages or food to hungry people, would say that
Sam Harris argues that morality and happiness are scientific questions, not religious ones, and the data supports his view. Studies in neuroscience and psychology show that happiness is more about factors like relationships, health, and financial stability than religious practice. For instance, the Harvard study of adult development, which has followed people for over 80 years, found that social connections and mental health are the strongest predictors of happiness, not religious beliefs. Harris also points out that moral codes existed before most religions, proving that ethics don't rely on divine command. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, was created without religious input, yet it upholds universal human dignity and freedoms. Rabbi David Volpe counters this by emphasizing that certain aspects of human life, including suffering and sacrifice, cannot be fully understood without a spiritual lens. However, while Wolpe's view stresses the importance of religion in guiding moral life, Harris insists that we can build a better understanding of well-being using science. The real question is, are we ready to let go of outdated religious frameworks and embrace a more evidence-based approach to morality and happiness?
I think that it's certainly in our society and in Europe, it's not taboo to preach atheism. More books are poured forth every day. But here's the question. I do want you to look actually at the historical record. Let's just take the Western monotheistic faiths, okay? Before they existed, think about the world. I forget the pre-state world, where cultural anthropologists tell us that about 1 in every 4 men died of violent death. And then you had pre-monotheistic regimes like Assyria, Babylonia, which were savage beyond the imagination of anything you will find in the Bible or anywhere else. And then, all of a sudden, when it became possible for there to be a regime without a religion, and you know when that became possible, right? That became possible in the French Revolution. That was when it first became possible to not have a religion. Now, is it just an extraordinary coincidence? The genocide started to enter the modern world, first with the bloodbath that followed the French Revolution, then with the Napoleonic Wars, that the worst war that ever happened in this country, the Civil War, was not a religious war, that when you had regimes, whatever you want to call them, that explicitly rejected religion, you had Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, I mean, I could go on and on and on. It just seems to me an extraordinary coincidence, far beyond the possibility of believing, to say that, no, what was wrong with all these regimes is that they didn't think like Sam Harris. Because it's true, they didn't think like Sam Harris. But the values that you take with skeptical inquiry are values that, in fact, were taken from the religious regimes that you find unpalatable and that were rejected by all these regimes that were genocidal, including, of course, the worst from the point of view of any single country, which was Hitler, Mao, and Stalin.
Okay, there are a few claims there that we have to shelve. One is this idea that you just claim that I got my morality from a religious tradition. Ask yourself, when you pick up the Bible or the Hebrew Bible or any holy book and find ethical wisdom in there, what is that process like? I mean, you pick up Leviticus or Deuteronomy, and you find that if a woman is not a virgin on her wedding night, you're supposed to stone her to death on her father's doorstep. Okay, presumably you choose to reject that pearl of ancient wisdom. And then you find another line, I think this is also in Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. Or the golden rule, as preached in the New Testament. And this resonates with you as a good operating premise to generate further moral intuitions. If nothing else, it's a good ideal to live toward. Now, that process, the guarantor of your morality in that case is not the book. It's in your brain. And this kind of truth testing is something that we bring to religion. Now, religion does a lot of work on people, and you can get good people to believe some very terrible things in the name of God, and this is what worries me about religion. And I think we waste time talking about Stalin and Hitler and Pol Pot, frankly, because these were political religions. These were dogmatisms through and through, and when anyone started to make too much sense in opposition to these dogmatisms, they were carted off and killed. These were not contexts in which rational discourse prevailed and the best idea won. So to call them science is just to misuse the term. And it's, I mean, in the case of Hitler, it's just a total non sequitur because Hitler never really repudiated Jesus, and he used Jesus in his speech, and he was facilitated by 1,000 years of religious fulminating against the Jews in the name of Christianity. I mean, religion is implicated, certainly, in the Holocaust. So it's not, I think, a conversation worth having.
I'm sorry, I brought a quote. This is from Viktor Frankl, who is a survivor and a therapist. This book, The Doctor and the Soul. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of a theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I'm absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry or other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers.
Okay, well that is an opinion that I think we can all reject on its face.
Really?
Clearly. Do you really think you think Auschwitz
Yes,
is the result
absolutely.
of
I
thinking
think
too
that the
clearly
rejection,
about the physical
yes,
world?
the rejection of transcendence and the idea that human beings are all heredity and environment and breeding and eugenics and social Darwinism was absolutely a much greater contributor than the
hatred of Jews?
Than the rejected Christianity. Well, it wasn't just the destruction of the Jewish people. It was, don't forget, World War II, right? This was much wider than the hatred of one people. But yes, why was it focused on the Jews? In part because the explanation that Hitler gave wasn't theological. The explanation that he gave was racial. Had it been theological, I would say yes, theological. But strikingly,
But weren't the
all
roots
these,
theological?
The history of anti-Semitism.
there was a long history of anti-Semitism, but why did it never explode into genocide in a Christian government?
It was, first of all, the history of the Jews in Europe is a history punctuated by rather ceaselessly by pogroms and murder that was explicitly religious. I mean, you have something like host desecration.
Yes.
I don't know if you know about this phenomenon that I came across while researching my first book. The communion host is thought to be, once blessed, is thought to actually physically be the body of Jesus. And therefore, if it's mistreated, this is, you can literally, in torturing a cracker, you are torturing the body of Jesus. There are accounts of whole villages purged of Jews who were accused of having mistreated crackers. So the question is, does the belief in the transubstantiation, which is a belief that I would have thought could be rather harmless, have anything to do with the idea that someone can mistreat a cracker and that you should kill him for it? Yes, it does have something to do. It's impossible to believe in the torture of crackers unless you think transubstantiation is a fact.
But what it's not impossible to believe in is the torture of one group by another. And that is, as you know, virtually universal in human history.
And it's given immense energy by religious hatred.
The question arises, in what sort of regime are you likely to be able to get a society a la America where that is minimized? And it seems to me quite clear that if you look through history, although the depredations of religion, we could spend all night talking about the terrible things that have happened in the name of religion. But that would have much more power if you took essentially good people and made them rotten, as opposed to taking people who are predisposed to both good and evil actions and given them distinct identities one from the other. Nation states, religions, neighborhoods, so on. And what you get almost inevitably is the action of one group against the other. And in fact, the only transcendent idea that I can think of that really does tie one person to another is God, which is why when you actually filter that book through a person, as opposed to, say, just opening Deuteronomy, which no tradition that I know of suggests is a way to learn morality, but when you filter it through a person, you get someone like Isaiah who criticizes Jews on the basis of the Bible that he knows far better than we, or Hillel who, when he's asked to summarize an entire tradition, knowing it intimately and intricately, doesn't say, go persecute someone. He says, what's hateful to you, don't do to someone else. Because even though you can cherry pick lines that are both funny and destructive, the truth is that every tradition is not made just of propositions. It's something that's lived and is bred in you, and if it works well, produces magnificent human beings.
Yeah, and the problem is there are many gods and books on offer.
Yes.
And they make incompatible claims about how we should live in this world.
That's true.
Again, the hope, you're proffering a hope for humanity, which is the right religion most of the time. I don't know how this is going to interact well with the spread of destructive technology. I don't know how we're going to get to a future where Muslims believing in martyrdom and Christians believing in the rapture will be a good recipe for good neighbors. I think that is a kind of a reductio ad absurdum of this more religion argument. Again, I reject the analogy to the most repressive totalitarianisms of the 21st century. I'm simply arguing that we need to cease to reward people for pretending to know things they do not know. And the only area of discourse where we do this is
Sam Harris shares the idea that morality and happiness can be explored through human experience and scientific understanding. Rather than relying only on tradition or authority, he turns to observation, reflection, and data. The Harvard study of adult development, one of the longest-running studies of its kind, has followed participants for more than 80 years. The research points to consistent patterns. Strong personal relationships, emotional well-being, and life stability are closely tied to long-term fulfillment. People have long turned to religion and philosophy to navigate life's biggest questions. Religious traditions have shaped laws, customs, and community values. These traditions carry teachings that many find meaningful. At the same time, history also shows moments when those same teachings were used to justify exclusion or inequality. These are all part of the broader human story, filled with complexity, struggle, and learning. Rabbi David Wolpe reflects on how spiritual life can offer a way to understand pain, purpose, and connection. He speaks to how stories and rituals help people stay grounded and compassionate. Sam Harris offers another lens, focusing on how people can build ethical understanding through shared experience, reasoned discussion, and careful attention to the outcomes of actions. Ideas such as fairness, dignity, and consent have developed over time. Philosophers like Spinoza, Hume, and others contributed to ongoing conversations about how people live together and make choices. These ideas didn't emerge overnight. They grew through debates, writings, protests, and lived experience. People from many walks of life, activists, teachers, neighbors, have helped shape the ethical frameworks that guide communities today. Moral reflection often happens through conversation. Disagreements, questions, and even uncertainty play a part in how individuals grow. Over time, people revise their values, respond to new challenges, and adapt to changes around them. This process doesn't require a single path. It allows for many voices, many stories, and many ways of seeking clarity. The discussion between Harris and Wolpe invites an open question. How do people come to understand right and wrong? Is it something passed down? Something discovered? Something created in response to real life? These aren't questions with final answers, but they're worth asking. They lead to reflection on how values are shaped not just by belief, but by participation, relationship, and lived responsibility. Rather than placing morality within one fixed structure, this view encourages exploration. It makes space for curiosity and conversation. It recognizes that people, through reflection, care, and connection, continue to shape the world around them. And in that ongoing work, there's room for growth, honesty, and a shared effort to live thoughtfully with one another.
Invisible order that gives them a life of a certain sanctity and holiness.
This is a general claim. Religious human beings generally live in harmony with...
No, I said my experience of certain human beings. I mean, I can keep going if you want me to keep going.
Well, no, I think you've put enough on the table.
Okay, but none of those are scientific evidence.
Many of those claims trespass upon the territory of science overtly. I mean, the claim about your understanding other human beings being suggestive of a divine artificer.
Is that a scientific claim?
Absolutely.
Extraordinary.
I mean, is your understanding of mathematics also suggestive of a divine artificer?
No, it has to do with my experience.
Your ability to learn language?
Do you understand? It has to do with my experience of you. When I'm looking at you right now,
Right.
You may assume that what I see is a material, but that's not what I see. And it's not what I believe. And I think that
I understand it's not what you believe.
There's something in you that is more than you believe. I really think so.
This is
now, if you want to make that a scientific claim, you can. But I'm telling you, it's a metaphysical claim, and to confuse the two is a mistake.
Okay, you can add any metaphysics you want.
Thank you.
In that, by that means, I mean, I can say, I see you as a reincarnate personality, and I think you were probably
I was someone famous
on Atlantis. Yes.
Right. Don't make me like a washerwoman in a previous
People do this all the time. I mean, you can broadcast. I mean, this is constrained by our common sense in every other domain of discourse. I mean, just take, for example, the people who think Elvis is still alive. Okay, what's wrong with this claim? I mean, why is this claim not vitiating our academic departments and corporations? I mean, I'll tell you why, and it's very simple. We have not passed laws against believing Elvis is still alive. The problem is that whenever somebody seriously represents his belief that Elvis is still alive in a conversation, on a first date, at a lecture, at a job interview, he immediately pays a price.
Yeah.
He pays a price in ill-concealed laughter.
Right. Now, surely you can agree with him on that.
That is a good thing. Now, then he could rattle on about this is not a scientific claim. This is a matter of faith. You know, when I look at you, I see you might be Elvis. I mean, he could do this.
Except that, you know, this is like I mean, almost all the books. I don't believe it's in your book, to your credit, but the Bertrand Russell teapot analogy, right, which Dawkins is so fond of, that there might be a celestial teapot circling the globe.
I think it's in my book too.
Is it? Shame on you. If you make a claim about the existence of a physical entity like Elvis or a teapot, yes, that is evaluated the way you evaluate any other physical entity. That's why I keep saying, and I will say it again, that it is not a scientific claim to say that I believe you have a soul or that God exists. If it were a scientific claim, then you would be able to evaluate it the same way you could get a telescope and look for a teapot, but you can't.
Let me ask a question that deals with, change gears on you guys here. A question that deals with human creativity. Okay. Religion has inspired a lot of great works. Look at the world of music, the visual arts. Okay, let's just for a second say the world comes over to your way of thinking.
Right.
How does that affect the arts? Music, literature, The Simpsons. You know, I'm just curious. What would the creative world be without that?
I think it's a false fear. The idea that we wouldn't find any reason to build beautiful architecture or paint nice paintings, but for indulging certain religious superstitions. It's just not. I think Feynman once wrote that it was a poor poet who must fall silent when he finds out that the sun is actually a massive sphere of hydrogen fusing into helium. I mean, it's not. The claim is that you have to take something on faith to be creative, and I think it's a product of an argument that you used briefly early on, which is a fallacious one. This idea that the percentages of people who do these great, I think you used it in
terms of goodness, not in terms of art.
Yeah, in terms of goodness.
Right.
Most people.
Was it not fallacious in goodness?
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
No, it's
that
fallacious.
too. Okay.
Most people are doing this good work are doing it for religious reasons. Well, most people, most of the time, have been religious throughout human history. There has been no one else to do the job. This is true.
Yeah.
I mean, most people who have plucked chickens have plucked them while believing in God. That does not mean you need to believe in God to pluck a chicken.
That is precisely why. That is precisely why it's important to look at the 20th century and the 19th century, when it was possible to have societies that didn't believe in God, and to see what happened.
But you have to
when
look
I
at what
did
else
that,
they
you
believed
said.
in.
When I did that, you said, but they didn't believe what I believe. And what I'm saying is that if
very
you had
few people do believe what you believe. Apparently.
no, I being Sam Harris here, not what I, David Wolpe, believe. You said when I said Napoleon, the French Terror, the Civil War, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, all these. As soon as it became possible to have non-religious regimes, look what happened to the world. You said, but what about people who believe what I do? And what I'm saying to you is that thus far in the world, extraordinarily enough, when you remove religion from a society, it is not ruled by Sam Harris's. That's not the way it seems to work. Now, you'll tell me this is a utilitarian argument, and indeed it is. This doesn't prove that religion is true, but it certainly does prove that there is a values vacuum in societies when you suck religion out of it or force it out that is, to my way of thinking, terrifying.
It does not prove that simply because you have to look at what else these people believe. There is a values vacuum in religion. There's a values vacuum in an organization like the Catholic Church that preaches the sinfulness of condom use in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yes, I agree with you.
Okay, there's a values vacuum in that same institution that shelters its pedophile priests.
Yeah.
Literally an army of child rapists,
Yes,
based on its own intent upon maintaining its integrity as a religious institution. There's a values vacuum in, and I could go on. It's not like religion is this perfect advertisement for the kinds of values you get once you believe that your book is dictated by the greater universe.
It is an imperfect institution that is adopted by imperfect people in an imperfect world. And if you expect that it's going to be perfect, then you will be consistently disappointed. And that's why every religion that I know of emphasizes the fact that goodness is a continual and often failed struggle. And
as does science.
One would expect that science doesn't emphasize that goodness is a continual but failed struggle, right? I mean, certain scientists may, but science as a whole doesn't say anything about the metaphysical nature of human goodness. And by the way, Richard Feynman said explicitly that science and religion ought to be able to coexist. So I'm glad that you quoted him, because that lets me get that little appercue in.
I'm going to step in here now. I'm getting the signal over there that, do we have the microphone available for questions? Where's Gotti? Do we have someone on this side who has a question? Yes, please.
Rabbi Wolpe, at the beginning of this discussion, Sam Harris talked about the Bible and how human sacrifice is pervasive in the Bible, and how the ancient Hebrews practiced it, but you didn't respond to that.
No.
And I wonder what your response would be.
Sure. I didn't say that it was pervasive. Don't want to. The answer is that human sacrifice was pervasive around the civilization of the Bible. And in fact, Gehenna, which is the Hebrew word for hell, is based on the fact that in the valley outside Jerusalem, that's where the pagan peoples around the Israelites did sacrifice children, which gives you some sense of the meaning of sacrificing children in Hebrew tradition. Yiftach was the only one who actually sacrificed a child and is condemned by it all through Jewish literature. Abraham, the point of the Abraham story, according to many commentators, which I take to be, is precisely to say that although the gods of the world up to that time do demand human sacrifice, God doesn't, which is why, as the psychologist Eric Wellish says, the key phrase in that story is, don't raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. Right? That's what the angel says to Abraham when Abraham raises the knife. And that's the key message. So to say that either the Hebrew people, the Israelite people, or the Bible advocates human sacrifice, and I'm not putting that in your mouth, but to suggest that is it's just a travesty of the Bible.
Well, I'd add a few codas there. The picture is not quite that rosy. First of all, the Abraham story does not end with any resolute condemnation of human sacrifice. There are a few lines where God condemns human sacrifice in Deuteronomy and elsewhere. There are a few moments where he...
Sam Harris throws a bold question on the table. Do moral values really come from religion, or are we just used to thinking they do? Take the story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham nearly goes through with sacrificing his own son because he believes it's what he's been asked to do. The story often gets told as a lesson in faith, but Harris points out something a little unsettling. Nowhere does it say, this was a bad idea. Instead, Abraham gets praised for being ready to do it. That raises a bigger question. What exactly are we supposed to learn here? Then the topic takes a turn toward creativity. Rabbi David Wolpe talks about how religion has inspired centuries of music, art, and beauty. No one's denying that. But Harris gently points out that creativity has roots in all sorts of places. Curiosity, openness, and imagination can spark in anyone, scientist, artist, believer, or not. He brings up people like Einstein and Feynman, whose work changed the world, not because of religious inspiration, but because they kept asking the right questions. Then the topic shifts to history's darker chapters. Volpe mentions regimes that rejected religious institutions and caused enormous harm. Harris agrees the harm is real, but points out those regimes weren't built on freedom of thought. They ran on dogma, control, and fear, just wearing a different uniform. At the heart of it, Harris isn't trying to erase religion. He's asking, what really helps us become better to each other? What kind of stories push us to care, grow, and build fairer communities? Maybe morality isn't something handed down once and for all. Maybe it's something people keep working on, through conversation, struggle, and a bit of soul-searching. Not perfect, but always in progress. What's your perspective on this? Do you believe religion is key to moral values, or can we build ethics and compassion independently?
It's a bit weird. Like, how is Yahweh the only God? Like, presiding over a council of gods. That doesn't make any sense. And then later in the psalm it says, I have said that you are gods. You shall be sons of the Most High. So in the psalm, what's clearly happening here is the word gods here, and some translation puts it in scare quotes. The word God here doesn't mean God as in like Yahweh. It means God as in like a divine member of this council, right? And God clarifies, the psalmist clarifies in Psalm 82, he says, I shall call you gods. You shall be called gods, sons of the Most High. So clarifying that what I mean is that you are not the Most High, you are sons of the Most High. In fact, there's one point in the Gospels, it's the only time this happens, where Jesus is explicitly accused of claiming to be God. It happens, they say, you're claiming to be God. And Jesus downplays it. It's semi-complicated in that there's a psalm in the Old Testament. This is Psalm 82, which opens by saying that Yahweh presides among the council of the gods. Elohim, gods. It's a bit weird. Like, how is Yahweh the only God? Like, presiding over a council of gods. That doesn't make any sense. And then later in the psalm it says, I have said that you are gods. You shall be sons of the Most High. So in the psalm, what's clearly happening here is the word gods here, and some translation puts it in scare quotes. The word God here doesn't mean God as in like Yahweh. It means God as in like a divine member of this council, right? And God clarifies, the psalmist clarifies in Psalm 82, he says, I shall call you gods. You shall be called gods, sons of the Most High. So clarifying that what I mean is that you are not the Most High, you are sons of the Most High, right? Okay, park that. And bear in mind that most Jews are familiar with Jewish scripture, right? Jesus is talking to his Jewish opponents. And this time, he says, I and the Father are one. Because they're asking about his identity. They say, if you're the Messiah, tell us plainly. And he says, I and the Father are one. And the Jewish opponents say to him, they pick up stones again. They go to stone him to death. And he goes like, I'm just telling you the works of my Father. What are you stoning me for? I've been telling you things of my Father. For which of those do you stone me? And they say, we're not stoning you for any good works. We're stoning you because you, a mere human, claim to be God. So they accuse him. Here it is, the most dramatic, most important moment of the Gospels for Christology. You're claiming to be God. What does Jesus say? Does he go, yeah, you're right? No, he says to them, have you not read your scriptures? Is it not written that you shall become gods, or you shall be called gods? So he quotes the psalm that I've just mentioned, which expressly calls non-gods, like non-Yahweh beings, gods. And when asked about his identity, he chooses to quote that psalm. And he says to them, is it not written, you shall be called gods? If God was willing to give those people that title, and the scripture can't be set aside, then why wouldn't he give that title to me? He then says, so why are you then accusing me of blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God? So he clarifies. They say, you're claiming to be God. And he says, have you not read your scriptures? This is just a title that was given to the divine council. If he'd give it to them, why wouldn't he give it to me? Why are you accusing me of blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God? Because they're the sons of the Most High. And so the one point where Jesus is explicitly accused of claiming to be God
He ain't stand.
In my view,
He goes, I'm not.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
I think he's saying he's not. So Christians again will interpret this and say like, okay, he's answering in a very clever way, which sort of doesn't deny his divinity.
Saying we all are.
But no, well, they don't want to say he's all, that we're all divine. They want to say that he is claiming to be God here, but he's doing it. He's probably answering in this way because he's being intentionally unclear because it's not his time to die yet. Whatever.
When Jesus is accused of making himself God in John 10, his response actually undercuts the idea that he's divine. He cites Psalm 82:6. I said, "You are gods, sons of the Most High." In Jewish thought, this didn't mean Yahweh was calling them literal gods. Most scholars agree it was a metaphor for Israel's judges or divine council members who carried out God's justice. Even the Dead Sea Scrolls reflect this same Second Temple Jewish idea that gods could mean heavenly beings under God's authority, not Yahweh himself. If Jesus had wanted to affirm that he was God, this would have been the perfect time. Instead, he points to Scripture where others, not divine, were called gods. That's a downplaying, not an elevation. The earliest Christians didn't even see Jesus as God. Paul's letters, which are the oldest writings in the New Testament, around 50 CE, never called Jesus God. Instead, Paul calls him the mediator between God and mankind. 1 Timothy 2:5. Historically, the belief that Jesus was fully God only became official doctrine centuries later at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Before that, Christian groups debated whether Jesus was divine, semi-divine, or just an exalted human. That proves the text of John 10 can't be read as a clear divine claim. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been centuries of argument about it. From a Jewish perspective, too, the idea that a man could be Yahweh was blasphemous. The Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4, is the core of Jewish belief. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Jesus never overturns that. In fact, when asked the greatest commandment, Mark 12:29, he repeats the Shema, affirming strict monotheism.
Their argument too. I think it's a really clever argument because he's basically going, you can't say that I'm blaspheming if I am upholding Scripture, right? So if you're going to kill me for that, and you're going to uphold your law, point out in the book where I'm blaspheming.
And the key thing to notice is that, like, in this case, they pick up stones to stone him, and he goes like, "Why are you accusing me of blasphemy? I'm not doing what you think I'm doing." And so when it comes to chapter 8, when it comes to John chapter 8, and Christians often say, "Well, why would they like throw stones at him and try to kill him if he wasn't claiming to be God?" It's like, well, because somewhere else in the Gospels they tried to stone him for claiming to be God, and they were wrong. So I don't think that they got it right, you know?
And what about the worship of Christ? Like the people at the time worshiping him?
This is another big thing, like worship. Worship is something that's only given to God. In fact, when in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, Jesus is in the desert being tempted by Satan, and Satan says, "If you just bow down and worship me, I will give you all of this land." And Jesus says, "Worship God and serve him only." And yet, throughout the Gospels, Jesus is worshipped and he accepts worship. So he must be God, right? A few things to note. First, how many times the first important thing to note is what the word worship means. It's difficult to define even in English, but in Greek there are two words that are typically translated as worship in the New Testament. One is proskuneo, and one is latruo. Proskuneo just means to sort of bow down or prostrate yourself before a higher authority. Latruo tends to refer to like cultic religious worship of the kind that you might give to God. In no instance is latruo worship given to Jesus in the Gospels. There is arguably an ambiguous case in Revelation.
This all ties together so beautifully. So we're going to get here in a second. But first, as a critical stepping stone, let's look at what he mentions here from Revelation, because it actually directly ties in.
It's a bit unclear. What happens is you've got the Lamb who sort of sits on or in the center of or nearby the throne. So there's the throne of God and there's this throne of the Lamb. And it's not entirely clear what the organizational structure is. So there's like the throne of God, and then the Lamb is like either on the throne or in the middle of the throne. And then it says that latruo worship was given to him. So the only two times it occurs is when we're talking about the Almighty God, the Father, and Jesus, and they're sort of together in a very ambiguous sense, and then it always uses the singular pronoun of him. It never says them, it always says him. So those instances of latruo, I think it's defensible that the person actually being worshipped there is God the Father, is the Almighty God. But it does seem a little bit weird that Jesus, or the Lamb, is like on the throne or near the throne. So maybe Jesus is being given latruo there, but it seems weird that it would say that they worshipped him rather than they worshipped them. You've got God and the Son, and they worshipped him.
Christians point out that Jesus was worshipped. They often miss the nuance in the Greek. In the Gospels, the word used is proskuneo, which simply means bowing or showing reverence to a higher authority. It's the same word used when people bowed to kings or prophets, not evidence they were considered God. The stronger word latrio, meaning sacred service owed only to God, is never applied to Jesus in the Gospels. This distinction explains why his opponents accused him of blasphemy but were mistaken. In John 10, he corrects them by pointing to Scripture. And when Christians later insist that his acceptance of worship proves divinity, that overlooks how Jews at the time understood reverence. Bowing to someone didn't make them Yahweh. Even Revelation, which seems to blur the line, is ambiguous. The singular pronoun in Revelation 22:3, "they will serve him," points most naturally to God on the throne, not Jesus. The fact that the early church spent centuries arguing over whether Jesus was divine shows this wasn't obvious from the texts themselves.
But it does seem a little bit weird that Jesus, or the Lamb, is like on the throne or near the throne. So maybe Jesus is being given latruo there, but it seems weird that it would say that they worshipped him rather than they worshipped them. You've got God and the Son, and they worshipped him.
But never in the four Gospels was...
Never in the Gospels is latruo worship given to Jesus.
This idea of Jesus being...
Not once. Isn't that fun? Isn't that cool? It does not happen at all. The key text here, by the way, is "Did the early Christians worship Jesus?" by
It's fun
James
for you.
Dunn.
Look at Mark's face. He's having a...
He's melting. I sweat over it. Is this interpretation that you have of Jesus similar to the Muslim interpretation of Jesus?
It is in the sense of not thinking he claimed to be God. So yeah, this is an interesting thing. So Muslims don't believe that Jesus died on a cross. They don't believe that he was God. They don't believe he claimed to be God. They believe he was a prophet. And so they take a lot of the same lines I do here. But of course, they're motivated for different reasons. Of course. I'm just interested in the historical figure of Jesus. But yeah, a lot of these arguments, like if you... And the annoying thing is that a lot of the time, this debate only seems to happen in the context of Christians versus Muslims, because atheists don't care. Who cares? Right. Oh, Jesus said, "Oh, I in the Father," and whatever, man. Like who cares? I'm going to go and get lunch. You know? But I'm interested. But it means that, like, when Christians are debating with Muslims, so for example, when Jesus says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, I'm the first and the last," you know, a Christian could say, "But in the Quran, that's a title that God gives to himself." You know, in the Quran...
so they're using Scripture
one of the names of God in the Quran is Al-Haq, which means the truth. I am the truth. And Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life."
Right.
And so if your God says that the truth is one of his titles, here's Jesus claiming to be God, right? So they have these kinds of debates. That doesn't do anything for me.
Right.
So when Muslims are on the offensive on this point, they will use some of the same arguments. They will point out that, like... Firstly, they'll be suspicious of John's historicity. They'll point out that when he says, "I and the Father are one," he seems to be saying that we can all be one all together.
Is it possible that the early language of Christ had different, like, oral tradition, that then when it was translated into Greek, some of those things got lost?
Yeah, so that's really important too, is that Jesus spoke Aramaic. So this is something that I always find incredibly interesting when people are really hanging on every word that Jesus said. Okay, you guys are listening very carefully to what I'm saying, right? You paying attention?
Yeah.
Can any of you...
No.
recite,
No.
excluding this one, the last sentence I just said?
Mm-mm.
Just tell me the last sentence.
I'm still trying to pronounce latruna or whatever. That depression medication you were telling us about. Yeah, okay, wow. So
side effects include visions of God.
Yeah. So, okay, wow, yes. So obviously there's going to be some...
You can't remember the words that I said to you 20 seconds ago, but I'm expected to believe that the New Testament authors who were writing, at best, decades after the death of Jesus, could remember his exact words and write them down accurately in a language that he wasn't speaking.
In a language that he wasn't speaking, is
no, wait a minute. Now, what's important to note there, though, is that, like, if I said something really particular, like if I were talking to you and then I suddenly said, you know, I'm a famous songwriter or something, that might stick in your memory such that in like a month or two you could remember that I said that because it was important. So if Jesus said, "Before Abraham was, I am," that's the kind of thing that people could remember.
This is my body.
Exactly. But like the "I am" thing, Like, oh, well, he was quoting the Old Testament. Okay, so we've got a Greek rendition. Well, actually, when we say it in English, we're using an English translation of a Greek text, quoting an Aramaic-speaking man, allegedly quoting a Hebrew scripture.
Yeah.
There are a lot of chains of transmission that we have to investigate and see what's.
And I might have misunderstood you, but 40 years later, at the earliest, I don't.
Is when it's written down.
If I'm quoting something you said last week, I don't know.
Yeah. Some people think that John's Gospel is earlier. So John's Gospel tends to be dated to 90 to 100 AD. Some people date it earlier because there's one verse in John's Gospel, John chapter 5. It opens up by saying, now there is a pool by the sheep's gate. And it says, at this pool, this is what happened. But John says there is a pool. The temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. And so if John's writing his gospel, and this isn't like Jesus...
He's writing it in real time.
He says, now there is a sheep's gate near the pool. If that sheep gate had been destroyed, then why would he have written it like that? So some people, for that reason, put John pre-70. Kind of interesting, but the important thing to note is that it's all speculative. But at the very least, we're talking. That's why I say at best, decades after. Some
why
scholars
did they wait decades after to write it?
That's a good question. I mean, why were the Gospels written in the first place, right? Like Jesus is going around saying his stuff, and he's got disciples and stuff, and there are different philosophies on this. One is that some people think that Mark's Gospel, which is the first one, was written in order to deal with the destruction of the temple. The temple is the most important site for Jews, even today, right? But the temple at the time, like part of being a Jew involved like practices that you have to do at the temple. So for them, this is like God's house. This is where it happens. And so when that temple is destroyed, what do you do?
Yeah.
How are you going to interpret this? And in many respects, Jesus is presenting himself as the new temple, And so some people think that Mark's Gospel is written as a sort of way to respond to the temple's destruction, because he talks about the temple being destroyed a fair bit.
Going back, what is it, 60 years? What was happening at the time that allowed John the Baptist to rise in popularity? Like, what was happening culturally? Is there any conversation about that? Why, like, forgiveness could have been so important?
Well, forgiveness has always been important in religious traditions, but it's seen as the prerogative of God.
Right.
And so it's unlikely that the Christians won't think that John the Baptist was actually forgiving sins. They will think that he was like announcing the forgiveness of sins or helping people participate in a ritual whereby God would forgive them.
But why was this so popular then? Were there other people throughout history at that time that were also implementing this? Like, what was the societal utility that made him rise to superstardom? As you said, everybody from Judea is going there.
We don't know, because we don't have a lot of details about John the Baptist in particular. But we know
fascinating from what you're telling me right now.
He's my favorite character.
Yeah, why is there so... I mean, obviously you're right next to the J-Man, so it's going to be tough to live in that shadow. But to me, you start something that seems to be a break off from Judaism. I don't know how many other of these religions are existing at the time, but he seems to be the one that's the most popular. And then his disciple becomes God. So what is happening with him?
I'm fascinated by him. And the thing is, we just don't have very much information at all, because the Gospels are so dense and there is so much in them. You'd be amazed at some of the things that you can pull out, and things that people are still noticing today that they haven't noticed before about the Gospels. And yet, for some of our most famous figures, like John the Baptist or like Mary Magdalene, these people are like hardly mentioned. We have like no information about them. We don't know where they get their names. We don't know why she's called Mary Magdalene. Was there a place called Magdalene? Maybe. There's a place called Magdalene like in Israel, but it's unclear whether there's a connection there. Judas Iscariot. Why is he called Judas Iscariot? No one knows. There are theories about this. It could be because he was a member of a particular sect that used to murder Roman officials with a dagger, and the word for dagger is something like Icarii or something, and there was a group of people called the Icarii. And maybe Iscariot kind of sounds like that.
But this is very derivative.
No one knows. John the Baptist is someone that we just don't have that much information about.
And John the Baptist was residing in the woods around Nazareth?
In the wilderness, yeah.
But around Nazareth?
Around like Jerusalem, I think.
So then how does Jesus even come to...
Another key point is that nowhere in the four Gospels do we see Jesus receiving the kind of worship reserved only for God. That's consistent with the historical evidence. The earliest Christians didn't see him as Yahweh, but as a prophet or chosen figure. In fact, this lines up closely with the Muslim understanding of Jesus. Not God, not claiming to be God, but a messenger. The difference is that Muslims deny the crucifixion, while historians see it as one of the few facts about Jesus that's widely accepted. But both agree that he never claimed divinity. We also have to remember the problem of transmission. Jesus spoke Aramaic, but the Gospels were written decades later in Greek, sometimes quoting the Hebrew Bible, and what we read today is an English translation of that. That's several layers of language and memory between Jesus' words and what ended up on the page. Scholars remind us that memory itself is fragile. Even in a conversation, we can't perfectly recall what someone said 30 seconds ago. Expecting exact word-for-word accuracy decades later stretches credibility. On top of that, the Gospels weren't neutral history books. Mark, the earliest Gospel, was likely written after the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 CE. For Jews, the temple was God's dwelling place. Once it was destroyed, followers of Jesus had to reframe their faith. That context helps explain why the Gospels elevate Jesus' role so strongly. Not because he claimed to be God, but because the writers were responding to a crisis and shaping a new theology. So when we look closely at the texts, the languages, and the history, the evidence shows Jesus never clearly claimed to be God. The idea that he was divine was a later development, not something he himself taught. So here's the question. If Jesus never actually claimed to be God, what does that mean for the foundations of Christianity today? Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into these kinds of debates.
Jonathan also mentioned the resurrection, and he said that there are only three explanations for the accounts of the resurrection: that the disciples were lied, that they lied, that they were mistaken, or that they were incorrect. If we assume theism is true, if we assume the existence of a God, then it may be that of all the plausible explanations, of all the possible explanations, the best one is that he rose Jesus from the dead. But in a conversation seeking to establish the very truth of theism, we must start agnostic on that position and then ask, sure, it's highly implausible that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen, or that the disciples were lying, or that the disciples were mistaken, or that the disciples were simply incorrect. It seems strange to me, for example, that the earliest gospel that we have, the earliest account of Jesus' death, contains no resurrection appearances at all. I'll say that again, the earliest gospel contains no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ.
Let's start with by the resurrection, because I didn't really get to touch on that much in my last rebuttal. You mentioned that the earliest gospel doesn't have any resurrection appearances, and as you acknowledged,
yes.
It says in Mark 16, the angels tell the disciples to go and tells the woman to go tell the disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So there is a implication that there's going to be appearances. Also, 1 Corinthians 15, which is an earlier account, does mention more appearances than any of the Gospels.
500.
Yeah.
Of course, I've always found that quite strange, the reference by Paul there to the appearance to more than 500. This is, I believe, the only account of such an event happening. I wonder kind of who these 500 are, if they ever thought to write anything down, if there's any other account of 500 people having seen this kind of stuff. We're not sure why it is that Paul knows this is the case. He doesn't give an account of where he got this information. It seems to me at least plausibly something that could be false, right? It's not, in other words, it's not like extremely well established that Jesus did appear to a group of 500 people.
No, I agree with you. That I don't think the appearance of the 500 in 1 Corinthians 15 is a strong evidential value. It's not a major line of argument for me. I'm just challenging your assertion that there's a developmental trajectory.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, which is fine, of course. You recognise that does exist within the Gospels. The only exception being here one reference by Paul in a letter, which, of course, we've got kind of no actual narration of the appearance. We've just got somebody saying that he's essentially heard that this is something that Jesus had done. Our earliest accounts of an actual narration of Jesus appearing to people don't exist in our earlier sources, except, of course, to the appearance to Paul on the road to Damascus, which would be an example of a group hallucination. But funnily enough, I find this quite interesting, is that it's often said that, well, the disciples couldn't have been essentially hallucinating because of the fact of group appearances. You don't get group hallucinations. But the only early account that we have of a group hallucination, that is the appearance to Paul and his traveling companions, is one in which the companions don't also see the the appearance. It's just Paul, which I find quite strange. So I'm dubious of
But
this.
they do have sensory perceptions of the encounter. But be that as it may, I do want to ask about, because coming back to your developmental scenario, Mark, we don't know what he would have gone on to say, because he finishes his account very abruptly. Scholars debate over whether Mark is completely intended to finish there, or whether he actually had an ending that subsequently got lost from verse 9 and following. So we don't really know what Mark would have said. And then Matthew and Luke are written approximately around the same time, and Luke doesn't seem to be literally dependent upon Matthew. So really your only data points are Matthew and Luke and John in terms of your developmental trajectory.
Sure, but of course the lack of the appearance narrative in Mark is part of that trajectory. Of course, this could be explained partly by that trajectory, or perhaps by the fact that he did write it and it got lost, or he just decided not to write it, of course. But I'm just kind of using the evidence that's being presented to me here, which are 4 Gospels, the first of which contains no resurrection appearances. And I'm thinking, what might explain the fact that as time goes on, the fancifulness of the stories seems to increase. Indeed, ending in John, the final edition, with the addition of Doubting Thomas, which seems to be a moral lesson against requiring evidence for belief. Of course, after Thomas touches the wounds of Jesus, Jesus says, that it's, he now believes, but blessed are those who believe without seeing. He believes because he's seen, blessed are those who believe without seeing. So what we get is the further away we get from the actual events that are being reported, the more fanciful the stories, culminating in a story that has a moral lesson advising people that they shouldn't desire to believe on the basis of evidence. This seems to me strange.
So that's not what John's saying there at all. In fact, in the very same chapter, he goes on to say, John, the author goes on to say that these things are written that you might believe that he is the Christ and thus have life in his name. In terms of what he says in verse 29 to Thomas, he's chiding Thomas for not having believed in sufficient evidence because he had the testimony of the other apostles. He'd been with Jesus throughout his ministry and observed the miracles and so forth.
Of course, John is writing at the end of John why he wrote his gospel, but I'm quoting the words of Jesus, right? So there's kind of a disanalogy here, or a difference here, which is that Jesus is saying, you believe because you've seen, blessed are those who believe without seeing. It's then John who says, oh, but I decided to write this down so that people will come to believe. That it's kind of 2 separate sources there.
Sure. So, first of all, I gave an explanation for an interpretation of what I think Jesus is saying. And secondly, Jesus, if you look elsewhere, for example, in Matthew 11, when John the Baptist sends disciples to Jesus, are we the one we're expecting, or should we wait for another? He says, well, go back to John, tell him what you hear and see. But he talks about the miracles that he's been performing. Right? He talks about the sign of Jonah and his resurrection as being evidence for his incarnation and divine identity.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Is there like a question?
Yeah, so I'm objecting to that particular point that Jesus does seem to affirm approaching this topic evidentially.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. That would be fine. I'd be fine to just kind of drop that point about John, but I'm not really sure if we should.
Okay.
It seems to me that seems to be the most natural reading of Doubting Thomas. You're saying that the story should in fact be interpreted as Jesus basically saying, you have believed because you've seen a lot of evidence. Blessed are those who believe having seen sufficient evidence, or something like this?
Yeah, so Thomas was discontent with having sufficient evidence, that he should have believed on the basis of what he already had. And God doesn't take well to people not believing when they've already got sufficient evidence.
Right, I see. That might be plausible. I'm happy to look into it.
The earliest gospel we have, Mark, ends with no appearances of the risen Jesus, just women told he will be seen in Galilee, and they flee in fear, Mark 16:1-8. The later long ending with appearances, Mark 16:9-20, is a known later addition, not in our earliest manuscripts. Then, as time passes, later Gospels add fuller stories, Matthew and Luke, circa 80-90 CE, and finally John circa 90-110 CE, which is exactly the kind of legendary growth historians expect. Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15, written in the 50s CE, says Jesus appeared to more than 500, but gives no names, place, or narrative, and no other source reports it. Paul also never met Jesus in life and says he received this tradition, so we can't treat it as checked eyewitness history, 1 Corinthians 15:3-8. Claims that groups don't hallucinate, overlook what psychology shows. Grief and expectancy can produce vivid experiences. Studies find 30-60% of bereaved people report seeing or sensing a loved one. Memory conformity then spreads and reshapes stories. Even Acts' accounts of Paul's conversion show his companions didn't share his vision. Acts 9:7, 22:9, which matches an internal, personal experience. John's Doubting Thomas ends with, "Blessed are those who have not seen," John 20:29, and the author says he wrote so readers would believe, John 20:31. That's faith-forward theology, not verifiable history. On balance, the earliest evidence fits developing tradition and visionary experiences, not a confirmed physical resurrection.
I did want to ask you, though, about your low intrinsic probability of miracles.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So, can you justify why you come to that conclusion?
I guess the point that I was kind of trying to make there was to say that in the context of this discussion, do you expect a naturalist to take as seriously the hypothesis that a man rose from the dead as he should take the hypothesis that, say, Jesus didn't die of something? Like, in other words, like, I suppose you're not surprised that somebody would not do that, but you're saying that they're being kind of irrational in doing so.
Correct.
Because in assuming that something like a miracle would have a lower intrinsic probability.
Exactly. So I'm interested in what your justification is for assigning such an intrinsically low probability to miracles.
Wouldn't you say, like as you said, the fact that this doesn't happen elsewhere would not be a good response, because that's what we'd actually want. This is
that's what
God
we'd expect.
Is trying to do. He's trying to put forward a unique event. Could not the same be said that the reason why the resurrection is a powerful vindication of Jesus' message is because it has a low probability of occurring, and so that makes it miraculous that God did it, right? Like, it seems to me that the intuitive force of saying, isn't it amazing that Jesus rising from the dead, isn't it amazing that happened and this vindicates its message, is because of the fact that we should expect this to be so improbable that if it really did happen, this provides strong evidence. And I also wonder if you think that it would provide the same evidence as any other miracle. That is, I don't know why it is that rising from the dead specifically, except maybe the fact that he predicted it, would be any more of an indication of his divinity than his ability to turn water into wine. If there was an instance of him having predicted that he would go on to do that and then did that, this seems equally miraculous. This is I don't see why the resurrection in particular would offer a vindication.
Sure. So for a number. Okay, so I'm trying to formulate a question. So Isaiah 53:10, for example, speaks about the resurrection in the context of messianic prophecy. Jesus himself says that the resurrection will be the vindication of his messianic divine self-claims. And so it's very surprising if God raises Jesus from the dead if he's a false messiah, for example, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense. Yeah. I think that answers it quite well, I think.
And would you also be amenable to the argument that you can bring other arguments to bear independently on Jesus' messianic and divine identity, such as some of the arguments I listed briefly, the trilemma, messianic prophecy, the conversion of Paul, etc., that would be relevant to establishing the prior probability in Jesus' case specifically?
I think you could do, but I don't think that it's been very well done. I don't think the examples that you say, like the trilemma, I don't think that's like good evidence of Jesus' divinity, nor do I think the conversion of St. Paul is particularly strong evidence of Jesus' divinity. I wonder, I know there's only kind of a minute left of your time, but what are the specificities about Paul's conversion that you think bear on the divinity of Jesus?
Sure. I'm trying to formulate a question. So it's my question time, so I'm rather than give a statement.
Well, I can ask you
when
the other time if you have anything else you want to say now.
Sure. Okay, so in terms of the argument for intelligent design, would you acknowledge that it's not a God of the gaps argument, that is actually a positive argument?
This is something I was going to ask you about. You said that it's not a God of the gaps argument because it's based on what we do know, and I forget exactly how you argued that case. If you could maybe just do it again briefly.
Yeah, so it's basically that there's a habitual association between information and conscious activity.
Right. Yeah. So I would say, for example, imagine somebody like pre-Newton or something, looking at the orbits of the planets and saying, like, I have absolutely no idea how they're up there, why they're spinning in the way that they're spinning. It must be God. Would you say that that is a God of the gaps argument? Mm-hmm. But suppose somebody then said to you, this isn't a God of the gaps argument. This is actually based on what I do know, not what I don't know, which is that there's a habitual association between things that we see moving, that don't stop moving, generally have some kind of agent causing them to continue moving. And so I say that the same thing must be true of the orbs moving in the sky. That doesn't seem to not make it a God of the gaps argument. That seems like just a way of kind of dressing it up.
When we ask how probable a miracle is, start with the base rate. Across billions of human deaths, there are no medically verified cases of a person dead for days returning to normal life. That makes the prior tiny. To overcome a tiny prior, you need multiple, independent, detailed sources written close to the event. Instead, we have anonymous Gospels decades later. Mark around 70 CE, Matthew Luke around 80 to 90, John around 90 to 110, and a brief list in Paul without names or locations. Low prior plus weak, late testimony. Low posterior probability. Appeals to prophecy don't fix this. The verses Christians cite aren't clear predictions of a Messiah rising on the third day. Psalm 16:10 is about David not being abandoned to Sheol. Hosea 6:2 speaks of Israel's restoration. Isaiah 53:10-11 concerns the servant's vindication, not an explicit personal resurrection. These are theological readings after the fact, not straightforward forecasts fulfilled by data. Paul's conversion also fits known visionary experiences. Acts gives inconsistent details about what his companions perceived. Acts 9, 7 verses. 22-9, which points to literary shaping, and his companions don't share the vision, consistent with an internal event.
That the naturalist will one day be able to explain and account for DNA replication, then that the theist will ever be able to account for suffering or hiddenness. Indeed, it's usually expected that the theist will never be able to offer such an account. Jonathan also mentioned the resurrection, and he said that there are only three explanations for the accounts of the resurrection: that the disciples were lied, that they lied, that they were mistaken, or that they were incorrect. I would add to this suggestion a fourth, which is that the reports themselves were inaccurately put down into our records, but I think Jonathan more or less addressed that by saying that the gospel writers were fairly scrupulous, and so I think implicitly trying to undermine that example. Now, I admit that some of the hypotheses for explaining what happened on Easter morning are a little bit tenuous. There have been theories that have been suggested and generally rejected by certainly most biblical scholars. For example, the idea that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen. These kinds of things are usually disproved with fairly intuitive points. That is to say, it seems ridiculous to suggest that Jesus didn't die on the cross. The Romans did know how to kill people, after all, and there would have been various other reasons, which I won't go into now for the sake of time, but I'm sure you're familiar with such a response. But you have to understand the context in which this conversation is taking place. If we assume theism is true, if we assume the existence of a God, then it may be that of all the plausible explanations, of all the possible explanations, the best one is that he rose Jesus from the dead. But in a conversation seeking to establish the very truth of theism, we must start agnostic on that position and then ask, sure, it's highly implausible that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen, or that the disciples were lying, or that the disciples were mistaken, or that the disciples were simply incorrect. But doesn't it seem less plausible yet to suggest that a man rose from the dead? To the naturalist, you can understand why this would seem like quite a leap, unless you've already assumed theism, making the suggestion that this God might have risen Jesus from the dead more plausible than these other explanations. Thinking about the evidence for the resurrection is a complicated topic, but it seems strange to me, for example, that the earliest gospel that we have, the earliest account of Jesus' death, contains no resurrection appearances at all. I'll say that again, the earliest gospel contains no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ. What the end of Mark's gospel does say is that, there's essentially a prediction. That is, we're told by an angel or presumed angel, that Jesus has gone ahead to Galilee, and you should expect to find him there. And this is where the original manuscript of Mark's gospel ends. Matthew, the next earliest gospel, does contain two appearances, one to the women who visited the tomb on the way to tell the disciples, and then a vision in line with the prediction made in Mark. Now, of course, if this was being somehow forged or something, it seems quite strange, or at least plausible, that this addition could have been made using Mark as a source, which everyone agrees that Matthew does. Luke, later still, contains even more appearances, including like the road to Emmaus. And then John's Gospel, even later still, provides more accounts of appearances, including doubting Thomas, and some other famous examples. I find it a little strange, then, that the further away we get from the origin of the source, the more appearances we see. The earliest gospel contains no resurrection appearances. The second earliest gospel does contain one group appearance, but it's exactly in line with what was predicted at the end of Mark. Anyway, this seems a little strange to me. Now, I won't suggest that I could confidently say that these gospels were forged, or that the writers were mistaken, or that somebody was lying, or that something got miscommunicated. All I'll say is that for the naturalist, these conclusions seem a lot more plausible than the idea that a man might have risen from the dead. I think that's all I've got time for, but hopefully we can speak about St. Paul in a later stage. Thank you.
When Christians argue there are only three options, disciples lied, were mistaken, or were right, we can point out a fourth, that the stories themselves changed as they were written down. This happens all the time in history. Legends grow, details get reshaped, and later writers add material. We see that in the Gospels. Mark, our earliest source, ends with no appearances. Decades later, Matthew and Luke expand the story with appearances, and John, our latest source, adds even more dramatic scenes like doubting Thomas. The further from the events, the bigger the claims. And there are contradictions. Matthew places Jesus' appearance in Galilee, while Luke keeps it in Jerusalem. The number of women at the tomb, the number of angels, and what exactly happens at the tomb all change from gospel to gospel. This is what you expect if stories are developing, not if they're carefully preserved eyewitness reports. From a naturalistic view, ordinary errors, embellishments, and visions are far more likely than one man breaking the universal biological rule of death. If another religion today offered the same kind of evidence for a miracle, would Christians believe it? What do you think? Is the resurrection better explained by faith tradition than by history? Comment below. Let's discuss. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more.